Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce Cameron
Penn, Clarke,
young geologist involved with the Council for Geoscience based in Cape Town. Cameron completed a BSc Honours degree in Geology and Paleontology in 2011 and a PhD in Geology in 2017 at the University of the Witwatersrand. Thereafter, he undertook postdoctoral research studies at the Aziko Museum, the Evolutionary Institute at Wits, and Durham University in the UK. He subsequently joined the Council for Geoscience in 2018, and as I said, currently based in the Western Cape. Importantly, and that's what he's going to be talking about today, he has established himself as the expert in the geology and paleontology of the Bokkeveld Group here in the Western Cape, and equally the Eastern Cape. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Cameron.
Thank you very much, John. Today's talk is on something that I'm quite interested in, of course, the Bokkeveld Group, but more importantly, how it is the best preserved non-polar high-latitude succession on Earth. And I'll get to that in a bit. So I just need to take you back in time for a little bit to the Devonian world. So Earth back then was different. The plates were arranged very differently. So to the south during the Devonian period, we had a large supercontinent, Gondwana. To the north, Laurussia and Siberia. And throughout the Devonian period, what happened was that Gondwana slowly was drifting northwards. You've got a closure of the Rheic and a gradual closure and a scissor motion of the Paleotethys Sea, which would of course form Pangaea in the Permian 150 odd million years later. If we look at climates through time as well, the Devonian period was a time of sort of relatively warm conditions. So we can actually look at the mineralogical indicators for climate. And what we can see is that there were no ice caps during this time period. So we know that at the poles, of course, it was cooler, but no ice caps. But as you can see, is that global climates were more or less equitable like they are today, is that we had this nice banding of climates from the poles being cooler towards the equator, warmer and drier. But the Devonian world was also important in that it was a time of innovation, depending on who you speak to. A Devonian paleontologist will tell you that the world has been in stasis for a very long period of time. Nothing really exciting has happened since then. In that, during this time period, and of course, we were at the right at the South Pole. But during this time period, the first plants took root on land, and by the end of the Devonian period, we had our first forests. At the same time, the first arthropods, or first animals, moved onto land. So it started with first this invasion of these little insects and arachnids. In the oceans, ammonites make their appearance, but also importantly, fish. A whole bunch of fish that we take advantage for today that we eat with our chips made their appearance. So the first modern type sharks make their appearance. Ray fin fish make their appearance as well. And then alongside this, fleshy fin fish like coelacanth make their appearance. So they lived alongside all of these ancient fish. So you had these spiny sharks, these jawless fish, and placoderms. But by the end of the Devonian period, those chaps went extinct. But importantly as well is that ancestors of these fleshy fin fish gave rise to the first tetrapods, which are our extremely great ancestors. So this is Opa Grootjie in the top right corner. Our ancestors made their first brave steps onto land by the end of the Devonian. So, quite a lot went down in this time period. So this, of course, had a knock-on effect, is that with all of what was happening on Earth, the actual biochemistry of Earth changed. So during this warm period on Earth, we had the greatest development or expansion of corals on Earth. So just about everywhere except for the poles, there were massive coral reefs that would extend for thousands of kilometers. But also at the same time on land is that with the rise of plants onto land, it created these new ecosystems and new food webs, new ways for weathering and the formation of soils. It was also importantly, it kept a lot of mud back from getting into these marine basins. So it's part of the reason why you saw this development or the proliferation of life in the marine realm as well. But also as well is that plants had an effect at creating new geomorphic terrains. So meandering rivers make their first appearance in these slow, lazy, slack water conditions on land. It's the first time we actually see this with the rise of plants, creating soils, binding soil together, etc. Now, again, with all this proliferation of life and all these things going on as well, it threw the biogeochemistry of Earth out of whack. And what we do see is that at no other time in Earth's history have we seen a large amount of these extinction events taking place. So in this column on the right, where it's got events, is you can see several extinction events that took place. So again, this had all of these knock-on effects with it. So whether or not this was the rise of plants and changes in ocean chemistry, those knock-on effects all was combined with Milankovitch events, we don't know, but we're still trying to figure this out at the moment. So going back to South Africa, given our very unique place that we're located at the southern tip of Gondwana and at the South Pole, we've actually got quite a lot of rocks, a large succession of rocks that were deposited during the Devonian. So this pretty much is from the uppermost Table Mountain group, the entire Bokkeveld group, and the lowermost Bitterberg group. And these rocks all crop out in the Cape Fold Belt, which we are in right now, those of us that are blessed to be in the Cape. So I'm going to be focusing on the Devonian period, going into a little bit more detail. So the big question is, well, of course, study these rocks. South Africa was located at high subpolar to polar latitudes during the Devonian period. So you can see on this little map over here, TA marks the Cape Basin. But most of our understanding of what was going on in the Devonian world comes from low latitude temperate conditions where, northern hemisphere countries are now. They were at the equator. And it's quite strange given that South Africa, as well as other parts of Western Gondwana, have got these beautiful exposures of these rocks. So it's been low-hanging fruit. So why should we study high latitude regions? Most of the information we know are from ice house world. So as we are in right now, we are technically in an ice age, but we don't really know about what was happening at the poles in greenhouse worlds. So when there were no ice caps, how were these places functioning? So at high latitudes as well, solar irradiance is lower, so therefore it's generally cooler. But what we do see is that we have seasonal changes in bioproductivity. Even though it's seasonal, what we do see is that when there are changes in bioproductivity, they tend to be the greatest regions of the generation of biomass. So this little picture in the corner shows this. Also importantly, there are periods of no sunlight and periods of extended sunlight. So how were these animals and organisms living in these conditions? What were their stresses? How did they cope with it? We don't really know. Also as well, if you look at the weathering means or weathering profiles, is that you have greater incidence of mechanical weathering processes. But again, this is all known from ice house worlds, whereas in greenhouse worlds, what was the precipitation rate? We don't know. We know now that at the poles, they are actually technically more deserts than anything else because of their low rates of precipitation. Was this or is this the same in greenhouse worlds? We don't know. We also know that at high latitudes, anyone who's done any sailing or gone out to sea, especially that have gone south or north of 40 degrees, will know how stormy the sea is in general. So storminess, of course, is seasonal. It's dominated by frontal systems, but also important at the poles as well. Tidal ranges are minimal to absent, so very, very low tidal ranges. The Coriolis force is at its greatest. So as the Earth rotates, it deflects wind. It's more stormy in general with low tidal ranges. And these regions as well, sea level tends to be lower as a whole, so they're more sensitive to changes in sea level rise and fall as well as temperature. So they're actually extremely sensitive environments. They're fringe environments as such. That's just the reasons why these rocks are important or part of them. But now just to go to the Bokkeveld group itself. So this map is a simplified map just to show the outcrop of the Bokkeveld. So there are 3 subdivisions of the Bokkeveld group. There's the lower series subgroup, which ranges from the early to the middle Devonian in age. And then overlying that is the Bido subgroup, which goes into the uppermost middle Devonian and its lateral equivalent, the Trucker subgroup. And you can see at about 21 degrees east, the stratigraphy of these successions change because the actual intrinsic properties, the stratigraphy of these rocks changes across this boundary. So this leads us to believe that in the Cape Basin is that we must have had two sub-basins, one to the west and one to the east. Then this is just now work that I've been doing, refining the chronology of the Bokkeveld Group based on its fossil occurrences and its environmental ranges. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but essentially that's what we are focusing on, and well known for its endemic fossil fauna of the Malvino-Eclosan, formerly the Malvino-Caffric faunal assemblage or the bioregional realm. So we've now managed to refine this biochronology. This is now going to be refined even further with latest findings we found on the Swart-Rickens Formation, where we actually think now that the Bokkeveld Group is much older, or parts of it are much older at least, than what we thought. So in the Bokkeveld Group, these are just some of the fossils that you would see. You've got these very early fish and sharks. You've got these fossil trilobites, some crinoids, very early fossil plants. And then when you go up into the Bokkeveld Group, early trees, the earliest lampreys are known, some of the earliest arthropods from Africa are known. What I haven't shown over here is now South Africa now has its first fossil tetrapod from the latest Devonian, which is quite exciting. And now in the Hermanus area, this is a road cutting by the wine estate. And typically in this area, this is what you would see as the Bokkeveld Group, these nice, thick, shale-rich successions of very many colors. These colors are due to effects of weathering, erosion, and diagenesis. That's what you guys are used to seeing with the Bokkeveld Group. I'm used to much better exposures in that I work west of here. So this is our Gamkepoort Dam. And as typical as the Bokkeveld Group is this hogsback type topography. We've got these alternating shales that are overlain by sandstones. And it's because of those changes in the overall sedimentology of the succession that gives us this characteristic hogsback succession. So that's a topography. So this is a Gamkepoort. This is at the top section of the Bokkeveld Group. This is at Groot-Rivier Hoogte and the Cederberg. And this hogsback topography and these alternating shale and sandstone layers form the basis for the stratigraphy of the succession. So it makes mapping a joy in that it's very easy to follow these things around the basin. This just shows you what the outcrop I'm used to looks like. This is work that is done in the past by Hannes Teron from regional mapping, just to show how these successions relate to each other around the basin. There's a general rule of thumb as one moves towards the north. The more sandstone-rich successions are thicker and they become more amalgamated towards the north. And in the south, these more mudstone-rich successions become thicker and amalgamate. Now, I looked at the geological maps now for this area, and out here, the Bokkeveld Group is undifferentiated in that all of these muddy successions have amalgamated together. So it's actually more correct to just refer to it either just as the Bokkeveld Group over here, or I guess the Bokkeveld Formation down here. This is a rough idea of what the basin would have looked like. This is from data from Teron as well as others, just to show the division. How this shoreline would have looked is that you would have had the shoreline that went around South Africa, and of course South America was to the west of here. We had two sub-basins, the Clan-William sub-basin to the west and the Agulhas sub-basin to the east. And where we are situated here in the Overberg region, we are right at round about this boundary between the two basins. So previous work that has been done by Tony Tankard and Barwith, they had a look at the Bokkeveld Group, at each of these successions. They looked at the lithological properties and the sedimentary structures, and they said, right, each of these mudstone, sandstone packages was deposited in a tidal environment. They also assumed that each of these coarsening upward cycles, these successions was uniform, so that these were just due to changes in sea level, normal processes that take place, and you had the same repetition back and forth. So this is just to show you an idea of what Tony Tankard and them always thought that the Bokkeveld landscape would have looked like on land, and then underwater you would see this. If you're in scuba diving, that's what you would probably look at. It's a very different world to what we would be seeing today. Going back to the fossils, what I'm quite interested in is that these are typical fossils that you'd expect to find. So these highly endemic Malvino-Clausen biota, so trilobites. The world's earliest known shark is actually from the Bokkeveld Group, it's Puka pampella. We also get these very interesting little starfish type organisms. So here by the 50-cent coin, here's one that's been fossilized on top of the head of a trilobite. We've got crinoids, fossil jellyfish, my true love brachiopods as well, that are also very endemic. It's quite interesting. So going also on the fossils, is that these fossils are quite interesting, is that we can use these fossils to work out paleolatitude and work out, based on their similarities, which regions were most similar to each other. So recent work that we've been doing was to try and revise these regions, these boundaries. So in the past, we thought that there were three regions that were latitudinally constrained: the Old World realm, which hovered around the equator; Eastern America's realm, which was in more temperate latitudes just south of the equator; and then the Malvino-Caffric realm. So these biogeographic regions were constrained to a specific time period in the early to middle Devonian period, and there were a bunch of endemic species that typify each of them. And then towards the end of the Devonian, there's a collapse and aggregation of these animals, and one sees a more cosmopolitan condition. So we've been researching this now to try to figure out how did this come about and why did it collapse. And then one of the first papers that have come out now is that we have a revised biogeography. So we looked at West Gondwana, see something different, Colombian, West African bioregion, this Amazonian bioregion. So the Malvino-Clausen bioregion is more or less equated with the former Malvino-Caffric realm. There's been a change in nomenclature in that Malvino-Caffric holds offensive terminology, but also as well, it's been shown that it exists, but with some modification. These are your typical Malvino-Clausen of the brachiopods. So brachiopods are shelly type organisms, all very interesting, their biology. Quite boring animals, they just really sat on the seabed, ate and reproduced and didn't do much. So a very enviable lifestyle in a lot of ways. But there were a group of these guys that are unique just to these high latitude regions, and some of them are unique only to South Africa. So highly endemic, and there's a bunch of them. The more exciting stuff, I guess, are the trilobites. So again, there are a group of trilobites that are only known from the Malvino-Clausen region and nowhere else. Some, of course, are only known to South Africa and nowhere else. But these main endemic groups coexisted alongside more cosmopolitan groups of animals, so echinoderms, other shelly organisms, so like clams, and then snails, which are more cosmopolitan, less specialist than anything else. But what's weird about the Malvino-Clausen realm is that things that aren't here and things that are here that are abundant, so conularids, which are a type of fossil jellyfish, tentaculatids, which are a shelly organism, which now we know are actually similar to brachiopods, and then hyolithids, which are another weird group of mollusks. But other things are quite rare. So graptolites are quite rare, which is a pity because if they're graptolites, we'd be able to date these rocks better. Conodonts are also unknown from here, which is also a bit of a bugger because these guys, there's little tooth elements we can use to correlate with other regions elsewhere in the world. Ammonites or ammonoids are unknown. You do see them in places, but they are sort of drifted into these basins. And then corals and bryozoans are also rare. So again, we're quite buggered in that we don't really know how how the Bokkeveld Group correlates with the rest of the world. So if we had to take this combined with our knowledge of the geology of the area of the Bokkeveld Group, sedimentology, as well as these fauna, we kind of can reconstruct the paleoecology of these seaways, is that the fauna lived in cold water or cool water, high latitude regions. There must have been some thermal boundary, some ocean current that prevented any long-term mixing with warmer regions. These guys were clearly specialists. But what we can see from their ecology is that these guys love to live on the seafloor itself. So they had benthonic lifestyles, and there weren't any carbonate reefs, and there were no ice caps. I'm now busy working now to try and figure out how the Malvino-Clausen realm came about and how it disappeared. What were these drivers? So as I said, we've got very poor chronostratigraphic constraints. But what we do know is that when the Malvina-Clausen realm disappears, we see these sort of invader taxa that come into the basin. So Troptoleptus is one of these brachiopods, is another guy, Rapidothyris, and when they come in the basin, the Malvina-Clausen fauna just aren't there. Stuff that we know from South America is that it seems as if Bolivia, Argentina, as well as in Brazil and the Falklands, is that it seems as if these things could be related to changes in sea level rise and fall that have been seen elsewhere in the world at the right time period to see this, but very, very shaky. Again, the successions over here in South America and in the Falklands are more vegetated over, they are inaccessible. You don't really have as much good outcrop as we do in South Africa. So I thought, well, let's try tackle this. So it does seem, this is just to show the idea from South America, what's happening is that these changes in sea level opened up these former seaways that were closed, and they created new seaways for the warmer water to come down. It brought these invading taxa, and these Malvina-Clausen guys didn't like warm water, and they expired. So this is one idea, but what we are seeing now with the latest research that we are doing is that we've compared global temperature fluctuations for the Devonian period against the longevity of these biogeographic areas. So what we have seen is that there was a cold phase in the beginning of the Devonian period, a short cold phase. The rise of this cold phase, we see a rise in an endemism in the creation of these biogeographic regions. And then towards the end of the Aphelion, going to the Javetian, we see there's an upswing in temperature. And with this upswing in temperature, we see a collapse of these biogeographic regions, not just in the South Pole, but elsewhere in the world. And we see that there's a drive towards these more cosmopolitan, more mixed faunas. So the question is what caused this cold snap and what caused the this warming trend? So we're trying to figure this out. And now going back to the rocks. Done most of my research in the Cederberg in the type area, and I'm hoping that lectures I can show you what I've seen, and we can take what I've seen over here as well as what other people have seen and apply it to the rocks over here in around Hermanus and in the Overberg region. Over the past few years, I've gone and studied both these successions, the series subgroup as well as the Beto subgroups. So this is just to show the stratigraphy of these successions and what one sees. So this is for the series subgroup, this is for the Beto subgroup. So during my studies, what I've seen is that there are 8 Lithofacies associations. So when we say Lithofacies association, it's the conditions under which the rock was deposited. And from there, you can interpret the environment from there. So because we know that these rocks were deposited in such a way under certain conditions, we can use those data to figure out the environments in which they were deposited in. So what we've seen is that there are 3 broad types of environment that one sees, is that you've got a storm and wave dominated shallow marine setting. So similar to our shoreline now that we've got around South Africa. So you'd have a beach, you'd have a shore face and an offshore region, and then all the sort of intermediaries between those 3 big divisions. A transgressive barrier lagoon. So again, in places around our shoreline, we've got barrier and lagoon systems, but this is quite different in this sort of in case over here. And then again, wave influenced deltaic systems, which we see again as well in some parts around our shoreline where we've got these deltas that have been modified by wave activity. So by far, the shorelines like we have today, those environments were most prevalent around the Bokkeveld Group. So most of the Bokkeveld Group shows it, and these little colors just represent these different sub-environments. And this is just a cross-sectional profile just to show you how a beach works and how a shore face works, for lack of a better word. And I can, of course, share this with you to read over because there's a lot going on here. It's actually better to do this in the field hands-on. So this is one of these coarsening upward successions. So you can see there's a lower shaly bit to the right of the image and an upper sandy bit. So that's what you'd see at the gross scale, but to a sedimentologist, we see things a little bit differently. We see, of course, the offshore would be more towards the right in this image, is that You've got a capping sandstone, which accumulated in the uppermost portion of the shore face and beach. We had this blue part of here is an intermediary. This is the lower shore face, and this green and blue is where the offshore and the lower shore face intermingled with one another. So you see little bits of both. If we go and put our nose on the rocks, these offshore environments tend to be quite muddy. I guess this is what we are going to see a lot of here in Hermanus, quite muddy. In places you do see these carbonate-rich horizons, so we're also trying to figure out how these carbonates formed. You've got the odd sandstone that will crop out from time to time, but importantly, the mudstones are where you find all of these interesting fossils and fossil spoor as well. So they are quite nice if you're looking for fossils. The shells are where you want to be at. Then as we move up the succession, one start seeing more of an influence of storm and wave activity, because you're starting to move into the breaker zone as you're climbing up the succession. One starts to see more of the storm scour beds, and then you get into the storm scour beds become more prominent. So you can see here you've got these storm scour beds intermingling, sharply interbedding with these more shaly units. And again, when we have a look at them, if we put our nose on them, we can see there's a lot of sedimentological indicators to show storm and wave activities. A type of bedding called hummocky cross stratification. You can see we've got these very low angled hummocks and swales, and a special type of rippling called wave ripple lamination, symmetrical ripples. We also see these giant gutter casts. So if you could imagine, so these things look like channels, but these gutter casts where these big storms would have come in and they would have really chowed the sea floor up quite badly. These are also things that we would see. And this is just if you put your nose on it, you can see a lot of indicators over here that would indicate that. And this is just to show what hummocky cross stratification looks like in wave ripple lamination. So from these proxies, we can figure out environment. Again, in the lower shore face, we do see fossils. So some animals seem to be more adept at living in these conditions. In fact, shore faces are the most bioproductive regions on Earth at present. Again, and you can see this from the trace fossils, there are lots of fossil spoor. These animals think life was good on the shore face. And occasionally you get the one or two plants that get blown into the basin because, of course, these are stormy conditions, and I'm sure if we had to fast forward a couple million years from now and have a look at the fossil record of our modern shorelines, we would probably see similar things. Then above this, these sandstones or storm sandstones become thicker as you get into more shallow water, and they become, this is what the lower shore, the proximal part of the lower shore face would look like. And again, you've got very, very thick hummocky cross stratification. These move more into indicators for fair weather action, so the uppermost shore face and beach environments. So again, we see a different type of cross bedding to indicate this changeover. You do in these beach environments see things that look like fossil plants, plant root impressions, as well as some qualified plant remains. So we know that we were very close to the source at which plants were growing. In some of these places, there are pseudo-coal deposits. These are probably the oldest coals from Africa. We just need to try and demonstrate it better. And getting into this transgressive barrier island lagoon, the Tratra Formation, this is quite unique. As far as I know, this is the only true lagoonal, high latitude lagoonal succession in Western Gondwana other than the Witpoort Formation, but this would be older. This is just in a specific part of the basin, the Tratra Boerplaas succession. This is just to show what it looks like in the field. Again, we know we've all been to a tidal flat before in a lagoon. We know that it operates very differently. Lagoons are quite sheltered. You don't really, waves very rarely, only in big storms will they break the beach barrier and have an influence in lagoons. Never mind that, this is from a publication, but what's nice over here, we can see these nice tidal couplets. So you can see where you've got slack water and flood water conditions. With these mud couplets, of course, the mud would be deposited during slack water conditions at high tide, the sand at low tide conditions. We can see some mud cracked surfaces. We can see evidence for algal sort of puckering on the surface of it. So a very, very nice succession but this we'll get to in a bit, formed under very specific conditions. Because remember, as we said, tidal successions are rare in high latitude conditions. So this was under very, very special circumstances that was formed. There's also quite a lot of fossil spoor over here. So again, we see evidence for organisms, making these excursions onto the tidal flats. So they were starting to crawl onto land. And yeah, life seemed like it was quite good. Lots of burrows, lots of biological activity taking place. So this is the actual transgressive part. So here we've got a record. So that was of the lagoon. Above this is the transgressive beach barrier. And this is this newly defined Groot Rivier member. And this has got very funny weathering effects that one sees in the field. Unfortunately, I don't think you'll see the Truckra formation here, but if I do see it today, I'll point it out to you. It's very, very characteristic. But essentially, this was a beach barrier. So as sea level rose, the beach barrier migrated landwards, and as it did, it migrated landwards, it plowed through the older deposits. So it's also quite interesting. You've got these buried shell beds. If you ever go to the Cederberg, you'll see these shell beds. You can actually see the old sea floor as it was 400 million years ago. So this over here is a colleague of mine from the UK. Him and I shimmied underneath this rock to go and look at this old sea floor that we were studying. So to try and figure out how these organisms, these communities, it's a snapshot in time, how these animals were interacting with each other. So that's a story for another day. This is just to show what happens with storm erosion, with rises in sea level. If you look at the image towards the right, lower right under B, shore face retreat, is that as sea level rises, storm wave base encroaches onto land. And what it does is it reworks the beach barrier, and which plows into the lagoon and throws a bit of the sediment into the offshore environment as well. But what's nice is that deposition tends to be quite rapid. So you have got these snapshots in the lagoonal environment that are preserved, as well as in the shore face that are preserved. So very, very special succession. Then going into the wave influence delta, this succeeds the Truckra formation. It's in the Bokkeveld. This is just to show you what a delta looks like. The sedimentological features show that it was influenced by wave and storm activity. So it's nice, again, we see some more hummocky cross stratification and intermingling with the subaqueous channels, which is quite cool. Quite nice outcrops towards the upper left. This is at Swartkrans, and you really need a very adept climber to go climb, shimmy down the cliff face. There's a person in the corner from scale to actually go and sample these black shales just to see if these might be pseudocoals, because when you go to the bottom of these cliff faces, you can see there are colified plant remains. But what's nice is that these sedimentological features, what's nice is that you can see cross sections through these old river channels. So these are dunes, this image that I've activated towards the left, these are dunes that are migrating in the channel, and to the right, this is at right angles of the same cutting, you are seeing a cross-sectional profile of these same said channels. So you can actually see the point bars and the overbanks. You are seeing an ancient river system that is about 400 million years old. So this is really, really cool. This is just to show how from top to bottom, it should actually be the other way around, since geologists work with youngest at the top, oldest at the bottom. But essentially what we think happened was that there was a period of low sea level. There was the formation of this incised valley. This incised valley became flooded, so it created the accommodation space for a tidal flat to form. It must have been more of an estuary than anything else. And then as sea level dropped, this estuary built out towards the sea and became a delta. We looked at all these rocks. And you might think, okay, cool story. What does this all mean? Well, since we are able to have a look at the change in environments through time, we therefore can figure out changes in sea level through time. So what this diagram shows is what we call sequences. So these sequences, we can figure out periods of maximum sea level rise or maximum sea level fall. And from this, we can create sequences. And from there, we can take these sequences and infer changes in sea level. This is just for the Bokkeveld Group. The latest research that we've done now is in the lower Wittenberg group, so this will be revised soon, is to show what the sea level was doing in the past. So from here, we can see is that these red lines show changes in where the greatest changes in sea level took place. So these were at the base of the Bokkeveld Group, at the base of the Tratra Formation, at the base of the Bido subgroup, and at the base of the Karoo Formation. So what I mean by biggest changes in sea level is where you are seeing the greatest shift in environments. So those are what we would call second order changes in sea level. So first order would be at a global scale, second order would be more closer to home, and then third order changes are changes in sea level within those second order changes. So again, we are now able to see changes in sea level through time. How does this compare to global sea level? Well, it does seem high latitude regions are very sensitive to changes in sea level. Is that what we can see is that there seems to be some correlation with the global sea level curve. It's a little bit problematic in that we don't really have any good age constraints to do this. If we did, it would actually be quite nice, because then we could calibrate changes in sea level happening at high latitudes to those at low latitudes to make a more informed decision on what was going on. So going again back to the fossils, is that we've seen, this is work that I'm doing now with guys in the UK, is we've now looked at these fossils through time, but what we've noticed is that there are changes in biodiversity, and these red lines that I'm putting on here now are just to show where you've got these changes in biodiversity. So we can see is that through time there's a stepped disappearance of the fauna of the Malvino-Clausen realm in South Africa. And at one point, midway over here, you can see there's these guys just disappear altogether, and you've got these new organisms that come in later on. So this is something that we've been questioning, what's going on. So we can see is that the initial observations is that the Malvino-Clausen, when they came, they took over, but there's a decline, a stepwise decline. So we've been investigating what's going on. So when you compare this to the sea level curve that we've reconstructed, there's an almost one-to-one fit. Is that changes in sea level were influencing the biology of the succession. So we can see is that with the Malvino-Clausen fauna come in with the transgression, with the rise in sea level, with subsequent drops in sea level, there are declines in the fauna. But what is quite weird is that where the Malvino-Clausen realm disappeared, there's a rise in sea level, there's a dead zone where nothing takes place, and then these new invading taxa come in with second order transgression. We've been trying to figure out what's going on. So again, we've looked at the fossil spur in this dead zone where there aren't really any fossils, what's going on. So we've looked at the fossil spur, and we've looked at the activities of these animals. So these are just the different activities. So pasicnia calling, repichnia or pasicnia grazing traces, repichnia walking traces, domichnia living traces, podichnia feeding traces, cubichnia are when an animal molts, it buries itself to molt. And what we've seen is in the Vablenberg formation, this is where the Malvino-Clausen make their last stand. But above that, you can see is that there's a huge change in the way that these animals were living. Superimposed on this are the most bioproductive regions. Again, these are shore face regions. So what we've noticed is that these line up with changes in sea level, but that there is this little zone where nothing takes place. So we've zoomed in on it. We've seen just below, there's a hell of a lot of bioproductivity taking place. So lots were going on. It was a good time to be alive. But just above that, there's nothing. These things almost look like pseudo-turbidites. So now we've managed to refine this extinction level event, and it seems that they disappear with a drop in sea level. So that's all I have to say on that note. So many thanks as well to the U3A and the Overberg guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about stuff that bores most people. And then also thanks to all of these guys who actually believe in researchers and they give us money to do stuff. So again, thank you to my employer, the Council for Geoscience, my former alma mater, WITS, WITS is #1, and then Durham as well. So thank you very much.
Before anybody asks any questions, I just want to say, wow, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. It was so detailed, so interesting. Thank you so much, and what tremendous work you do.
Thank you. And yeah, hopefully today in the field, you're joining us, and maybe we'll be able to uncover nice discovery in one of these road cuttings. I'm quite eager to see it. It's a lot better to explain this in the field than on a presentation. So, but thank you very much.
Cameron, yeah, just taking into account that a large part of the audience are non-geologists with a usually different perspective on time, quite short-lived. So in the beginning, you were mentioning that we are in a cold and ice age. Now, a lot of them with this climate change going on are thinking, okay, how can you say that? Now, can you sort of make a guess or just say to us how long it's going to take for us to get out of it into a tropical environment in terms of geological time?
So right now we are, again, what I was showing with those sea level changes is that you get these big changes in sea level and there's smaller changes within it. Similarly with climate, it's the same thing. So we are in an overall ice earth condition, but we are in a warm period within that ice earth condition. Humans are doing with anthropogenic effects. You can see the data. It does seem to indicate, that humans are spurring this on. We are making it, this interstadial warm period, much warmer than what it should be and much more rapidly. So if we continue on this path, maybe, within the next century, it could be more warmer and we might have an ice-free, the northern hemisphere, the Arctic Circle might be ice-free. So this is the problem with being a geologist, is that we work in relative terms, we don't work in definite terms. Any geologist who works in definite is a liar. We can't give an exact amount of time on this, but what we are seeing is that humans are buggers. We are really making things we're actually making it much worse for ourselves. But then again, as Spike McCarthy used to tell me, or tell us, he said, yeah, actually global warming is a good thing. It expands more arable land for agriculture to take place. He says what you don't want is the big freeze. That he always used to warn us, that is a problem. But right now what we do see is that these fluctuations in temperature through time are mainly related to what we call Milankovitch cycles. So astronomical cycles that through time Earth's orbit is more elliptical, and it is slightly closer to the sun at times and slightly further from the sun at times, and other times it becomes more elliptical. At other times as well, the tilt of the axis of the Earth, how it tilts. At sometimes the hemispheres are closer to the sun, other times they're further away, and then the orbit of the Earth itself on its axis can wobble. So these things almost work like clockwork. And these Milankovitch cycles, they normally work on the order of anywhere between 50 to 250,000 years. So we've been in our interstadial now. I think this warm period has lasted, I think, I stand to be corrected, for the last 15 to 25,000 years. So in geological terms, we are maybe halfway through our warm period. And we've still got another 50-odd thousand years to go before we go into a cold period. So that's about the best estimate I can give.
Cameron, the last ice age was 20,000 years ago, and the modern climate is really only 10,000 years. The whole of human written history, civilization, is only in the last 10,000 years. I just wanted to mention that the estuaries near where you are now, the Klein River and the Bot River, they would be nice models, I think, from what your diagram showed, for the Tra-Tra formation. They're filling in delta at the river end and flood tidal delta from the sea end, and they've got to live there. They're gradually filling up, and then they'll be excavated next time sea level goes down. So the coast was normally 130 meters below sea level for most of the time in a wide coastal plain, and then temporarily just got a short period of relatively warm with a narrow coastal plain and a high sea level.
Thanks, John.
Cameron, I have a question. Can you please explain the hummocky cross stratification?
Sure. So hummocky cross stratification is, for a long time in South Africa, has been a bit of a dirty word. In that for a long time, for most of the world, is that people didn't believe that this existed. So essentially, the problem with hummocky cross stratification is that it's one of these bed forms that is incredibly difficult for us to model in a lab setting. But what we think, or how it forms with the more recent work that has been done, is that the idea is that you have a storm surge that comes in. The storm surge, as a storm cell, you can imagine what's happening with the energy in water is that it's moving in a circular fashion. As that storm surge, that storm wave, that orbital motion comes in, it intersects the shore face, intersects that energy backs up, and you have the formation of waves. Now, storm waves interact with the shore face a lot deeper because these are bigger. They're exceptional waves that come through. So what it does is it scours the top surface of that bed, and it forms these very broad, long wavelength hummock and swell type topography. That sediment gets entrained into the flow, and it gets dumped back down, and it settles out, and it mimics this topography, this low angle hummock and swell topography. So the issue that we've got is that in our wave labs, when we do any hydrodynamic modeling, is that I don't think our flow labs are large enough to actually observe this phenomenon. But what we do know is that if there's that hummocky cross stratification only occurs in a very specific range, grain size range, in that if you model these conditions in slightly coarser sediment, you form wave ripples. So that's how we know is that the two are genetically related. Wave ripples are a more coarser grained manifestation of hummocky cross stratification and more finer grained deposits. So it's very, very characteristic sort of thing. And in South Africa, it's only really, people are only really appreciating it now, like about 30, 40 years down the line after it was proposed. So the actual old name for it was wacky cross bedding, which I think should have stayed. I preferred the old name of it, but it's quite nice to see, forms pretty patterns as well.
So typically, how thick are these stratifications?
So the actual stratifications themselves, going down to the level of bed, they're normally about a centimeter at most, but these storm beds as well can be quite thick. They can, a co-set of these storm beds where you've got a prolonged period of storm activity, can be anywhere tens of centimeters to up to about a meter and a half in the most distal regions of the shore face. Of course, as you move closer to the shoreline, these packages can be quite thicker. But if you're actually looking at one pulse of sedimentation or one sort of event, maybe about 40 centimeters at most of an entire package within a storm cycle. So about 10 to 20 surges that are preserved in there. So they're not very thick, but you will see them. They will stand out once your eye gets in for it.
Cameron, getting back to some of the things we talked about last night, we have these gorgeous, colorful rocks here on the Western Cape, and we've now seen that they have a great deal to offer and show us and teach us about the Devonian and particularly sort of Earth history at that time. But if you look around the Western Cape and obviously the Eastern Cape too, these rocks support our agriculture. They were originally sort of considered to be quite boring, and it was the same with the old the Table Mountain sandstone, boring bunch of white rocks. Now it turns out they have huge aquifers, and we here in the Western Cape, particularly Hermanus and now Cape Town, making use of those massive aquifers. So just give us a little bit of background about the sort of broader economic aspects of these amazing rocks, and why they are important and why we should actually be basically looking after them and understanding them better.
Yeah, so that's actually quite correct, John. So If you look at most of the agriculture in the Western Cape, it's supported on about 3 to 4 different rock types. So the Bokkeveld Group, the shells of the Bokkeveld are one of them. Some agriculture takes place in these more recent age sandy type stuff. There's also a lot of agriculture that takes place in more loamy, muddy type rocks in the Karoo supergroup, so in the Eka group, as well as the Lomos Beaufort group. So these rocks over here form these magnificent, very rich soils that, well, not very rich, but rich soils that allow agriculture to take place. So what we are doing now at the Council for Geoscience is we're actually mapping with our expanded mapping program, is that we actually are mapping these things in a hell of a lot of detail, more so than what we have in the past. These rocks, we do need to pay attention to them, and we need to also look at this also from a geomorphic perspective. Is where are these rocks occurring where you've got, I don't know, changes in aspect, or we've got specific aspect conditions where these slopes face face the north or face the prevailing rain direction, where their topography changes, where they're more gentle, where you will expect to have thicker soil profiles being developed, etc. But these are the backbone of the economy in a lot of ways. I mean, we can do without computers and cell phones, but we can't do without food, and definitely water as well. So the Table Mountain Group and the Bokkeveld Group, that couplet, these guys are the heroes of the Western Cape. I don't mean to sound biased or anything, but I don't like being thirsty or hungry. So thanks rocks, appreciate it. We do need to conserve it, you're right. In South Africa, we need to probably stop thinking of, when we think of economic resources, we think of metals and minerals. We don't think of agriculture. It's always, the ARC will sort that out for us. The ARC just look at soil, they don't look at geology. And I think it's high time that all of us started doing this now and appreciating it more.
Cameron, quite a while ago, when we were doing work off the west coast of the Orange River for an environmental impact assessment, we deployed a thing called a benthic boundary layer experiment to deploy and to record currents in non-stormy conditions and stormy conditions. And we didn't have a lot of success, but the idea was very good. A place to do that sort of work actually could be Walker Bay, because the swell comes in from the southwest, absolutely parallel to the beach there. And the CSI, I've done quite a lot of wave research decades ago, but there'd be room to do an experiment of measuring the turbidity of the water in non-stormy times and stormy times, and then also to have a video camera recording those things at the same time, and then also to go out with underwater photography to photograph the modern analog for hummocky cross stratification. So I don't think I've read any paper which says this is what they look like in the modern environment.
Yeah, this is the big problem, and also why a lot of South African geologists have been very hesitant about recognizing it in the field. A lot of the times people would just bird off and just say, oh, well, they would just call it cross-bedding, and they wouldn't say anything further, or these are clearly subaqueous channels, but where's the channel? You can't see it. There's no nice ribbon form shape, but anywho, that would be first prize, is that if we could observe it in the modern day, it would be big news.
Yeah, good to hear that Walker Bay is starting to get attention. I mean, it's quite a critical area for lots of reasons. This whole effort on coastal geology and our local geology becomes more and more important. And obviously for us people up here in the Overberg and the Hebelanada Valley, the terroir is terribly important for particularly obvious reasons. So it gets back to my point about there's a whole economic aspect to all of this geology of ours, and we best taking greater attention about it.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying to you yesterday, is that it blew my mind what John was saying with terroir. Because I've been in touch with a guy who's quite big in the Cape Winelands area. When he explained to me terroir, I took him out into the field on a dig that we were doing out near Worcester, and we were pulling out these fossil sharks just recently and fossil plants, and he said, yeah, that's that contributes to the terroir of the wines in this region. And and when he explained to me the concept of terroir, where he said there's actually no real English word for it, he said you could grow these vines on soils that have a similar geochemistry, and the wine would taste different. It's the fossils that add to the zhuzh of the wine.
Worth mentioning that Tim Hamilton Russell, who really was the starter of the wine in the Emerald Valley, did so 50 years ago, after having exhaustive tests done on the climate and the soil. And from that, 50 years ago, has flowed the wine industry here. In the same year, 1971, Saki Rust and I wrote the first South African stratigraphic code. And that was the first time that we had recognized the fairly primitive distinction between biostratigraphy and lithostratigraphy. And you, Cameron, have made the rocks sing in both ways, both in terms of their lithology, but also in terms of the life forms that many of us perhaps hadn't really grasped how much had been done in that regard. And I'd like to thank you very much for your talk.
No, thank you, and it's you guys who actually, laid the foundations for us, and really thank you guys as well, laying down the foundational work. When you guys had to do work, it was really still a really open field, and thank you guys for inspiring us to go further as well.
Just got the last comment that in 1970, Bobby Danchin did his PhD on general geochemistry. And in 1971, Pierre Hoffmeyer, who lives in Gordons Bay, he did his PhD on the trace elements of the shells.
Cameron, I wish to add my gratitude and congratulations for all the detailed work that you are doing and helping us understand the complex geology of our area. This is obviously very important for the agriculture in our region, including the wine farms in the Hemel and Aarde Valley, of which we are so proud. Thank you for the preparation and for the beautiful and intricate diagrams and graphics that you included in the presentation. And thank you to everybody who participated in the presentation this morning. Goodbye.